I had been hiking for hours now, and the thick canopy above me made everything feel dim and suffocating. It was the kind of forest you see in old movies, dark, dense, and seemingly endless. I had read up on the trail before heading out. Supposedly, it was a quiet, scenic route, but now that I was deep in it, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The air was thick with humidity, and the scent of damp earth was heavy in my nostrils. My feet squelched in the mud as I pressed on, the path narrowing and twisting like it had a mind of its own. Trees lined either side of me, their trunks towering high, moss clinging to their bark, twisting roots crawling across the ground. It felt like they were reaching out, trying to pull me deeper into the woods. I glanced at my phone. No signal. Of course, that's always how it goes. The thought of turning back crossed my mind, but the thought of retracing my steps through the same winding trail felt worse. My body felt heavy, tired from the weight of the backpack and the day's hike, but I pressed forward. It was supposed to be an easy hike. What was I worried about? The deeper I went, the quieter it became. The usual forest sounds, the rustling of leaves, the occasional bird chirping, faded. In their place, there was a low, almost imperceptible hum. Couldn't place it. It wasn't from the trees or the wind. It didn't belong here. I paused, looking around. The stillness felt unsettling. My breath quickened, but I brushed it off as nerves. Nothing to worry about, just keep going. The trail started to rise, and I climbed higher, the slope growing steeper with each step. My legs burned, my boots sinking into the soft dirt. Every so often, I'd pass a small clearing, but there was no sign of anyone else. I hadn't seen another hiker in hours. That in itself wasn't odd. The trail wasn't exactly popular, but it wasn't comforting either. After what felt like an eternity, the trail began to level off, and I could hear the faint sound of running water ahead. A stream, maybe. I pressed on, eager for a break. The forest started to open up a bit, the trees less dense. The sound of the stream grew louder, and soon enough, I came across it. A narrow, rocky creek, its water flowing clear and cold. I stopped for a moment, letting my feet rest, dipping my hand into the water. The coolness was a welcome relief against the heat of the day. I sat on a large rock by the edge of the stream, pulling out my water bottle and sipping. The forest still felt off, like something wasn't quite right. I had always enjoyed the solitude of hiking, the quiet, but today it was different. There was an unease in the air that I couldn't shake. I glanced around again. The trees were still, the only movement the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. But then I noticed something, just a flicker in the corner of my eye, a shadow. I turned my head quickly, my heart pounding, but saw nothing. The trees, the rocks, the creek, everything seemed normal, too normal. I shook my head. It's nothing, I muttered to myself. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I was tired, hot, and a little too focused on the eerily quiet surroundings. No one else had come this way for a while, it seemed. That was all. I stood up and continued down the trail, following the stream as it wound its way through the woods. The trail was narrowing again, and I had to step carefully over rocks and roots. The sound of the creek was now constant, rushing beside me as I walked. My mind wandered back to the noise I thought I'd heard earlier. What was that hum, and why had the forest gone so quiet? It wasn't normal for everything to go silent like that I reached a bend in the trail, the water running louder as I rounded the corner. But then I froze. Something was wrong. At first, I couldn't place it, but then it hit me. I was no longer hearing the creek. The sound had vanished. I stepped forward cautiously, looking around. The forest had grown unnaturally still. The air felt thick, almost oppressive, like the weight of the silence was pressing in on me. A flicker of movement caught my eye again, but this time, I wasn't imagining it. There, between the trees, I saw it, a figure. Someone standing in the distance, partially obscured by the trunks. I blinked, rubbed my eyes. The figure was gone, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave. I quickened my pace, trying to convince myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks again. But the feeling lingered, crawling under my skin, making my pulse race. The trail dipped down into a small hollow, and ahead of me, I saw a narrow bridge crossing over the creek. The water beneath it rushed in a way that sounded louder than before. I made my way toward the bridge, my footsteps quick and uneven, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I crossed the bridge quickly, the wooden planks creaking beneath my feet. Once across, I felt a brief sense of relief, but only for a moment. The eerie feeling remained, thick as ever. Then it happened. A loud snap, a twig breaking. Someone or something was behind me. I spun around, my heart slamming in my chest. The woods were empty, but I could feel it now. Someone was there. I could feel their presence, just out of sight, lurking in the shadows between the trees. I didn't wait around. Panic flooded me as I started to run, the sound of my footsteps echoing through the trees. The trail twisted and turned, but I didn't care about the path anymore. I just needed to get away, to get back to where I'd come from. The trees seemed to close in on me as I ran. The air was thick with the scent of pine, damp earth, and something unfamiliar, a metallic tang that I couldn't place. My breath came in ragged gasps, my legs burning with the strain of running. I pushed myself harder, ignoring the ache in my chest. The trail stretched on endlessly, each step heavier than the last. I glanced back, half expecting to see something or someone following me, but there was nothing. The woods were still. I didn't know how much time had passed, but eventually, the trail began to widen. I slowed down, my body too exhausted to keep up the frantic pace. The dense forest had opened up into a clearing, and I saw the familiar outline of a cabin in the distance. A lone cabin, far from the main trail, tucked away at the edge of the forest. I stumbled toward it, hardly able to believe I had found it. The cabin wasn't much, a small, weather-beaten structure, but it meant safety. It meant a way out of this unnerving wilderness. I approached carefully, my mind still racing. The door was ajar, a thin crack of light spilling out into the darkening evening. I pushed it open slowly, and the sound of the hinges creaked in the silence. Inside was a simple room. No furniture, no sign of life, just dust and cobwebs. A long-forgotten shelter, it seemed, but it was shelter nonetheless. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me with a soft click. I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding, my heart slowly returning to normal. I'd made it. I leaned against the wall for a moment, trying to gather my thoughts. What had just happened? Was it the woods playing tricks on me? Had I imagined the figure? Had I been lost in the trees for too long? But as I stood there, breathing in the stillness, something caught my eye, a shape in the far corner of the cabin. At first, I thought it was just another shadow, but as I looked closer, I saw it. Something was there. Someone, person, or what was left of one. I didn't scream, couldn't. My body was frozen, rooted to the spot. The figure was slumped against the wall, covered in dirt, eyes wide open. The body looked wrong, distorted. I didn't need to see any more. I backed out of the cabin, my legs shaking, my mind too scrambled to process what I had just found. I had to leave, had to get out of there. I ran. By the time I finally found my way back to the main trail, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the woods in a cloak of darkness. But the forest was no longer silent. I heard the distant sound of the creek again, the rustling of leaves, and the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. But this time I wasn't alone. I had been planning the hike for weeks. The weather was finally perfect. Clear skies, a slight breeze, and a crisp air that reminded me how much I'd missed the outdoors. I've always enjoyed hiking alone. There's something about being away from the noise of the city that clears my mind. The thought of being deep in the woods, surrounded by nothing but nature, was something I longed for. The trail I chose was a bit more secluded than the usual routes, a place where fewer hikers went. It was known for its breathtaking views and untouched terrain. There weren't many signs about it, which was why I found it so appealing. I knew it wouldn't be overcrowded, and I liked the thought of having the place to myself. I packed my backpack the night before: water, snacks, a map, a first aid kit, and my camera. It was a long trail, and I planned to spend the entire day out there, taking my time to explore. I woke up early, excited, and set off just as the sun began to rise. The cool air hit me as I stepped out of the car, and the silence of the forest greeted me like an old friend. The trail started off easy, just a gentle incline. As I walked deeper into the woods, the sounds of the city faded away completely, replaced by the rustling of leaves and the occasional call of a bird. I loved how peaceful it was, how every step I took seemed to bring me closer to something untamed and raw. The trail twisted and turned with narrow paths that cut through thick foliage. Every now and then, I would stop to take a breath and look around. There was something almost surreal about the landscape. The towering trees, the dense underbrush, and the occasional flash of a deer or rabbit darting through the brush. But as I ventured further into the forest, something began to change. I couldn't quite put my finger on it at first. It was just a feeling, a sense of unease that started to creep in. The birds had stopped chirping, and the air felt heavier, as if it were pressing down on me. The wind had died down, and the usual comforting sounds of the forest seemed to vanish. It was odd, but I brushed it off. Maybe it was just my imagination, or maybe I was overthinking it. I continued on, focusing on the trail ahead. The path started to get steeper, and the trees grew denser, blocking out more and more of the sky. I hadn't seen another hiker since I started, and that was fine with me. I enjoyed the solitude. But then, as I rounded a bend in the trail, I noticed something strange: a set of footprints. At first, I thought they were just animal tracks, but as I got closer, I realized they were human. The prints were fresh, too, with the dirt still slightly disturbed around the edges. They weren't very deep, and they seemed to fade off into the woods, disappearing into the thick brush. I looked around, scanning the area, but there was no sign of anyone. I hadn't heard anyone approach, nor had I seen any signs of another person on the trail earlier. The thought of someone else being out here was unsettling, but I didn't think too much of it. After all, the trail wasn't marked as heavily traveled, and it wasn't uncommon for people to go off the main paths. I moved on, but the feeling of being watched crept in. Couldn't shake it. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, it felt like there was something or someone just out of sight, following me. The weight of the silence seemed to grow with every step I took. My mind raced, and I tried to convince myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on me. The path began to narrow, and I had to push through thick brush to continue. I was getting further away from the main trail, and the thought of being lost began to nag at the back of my mind. I checked my map, but the markers were sparse, and I wasn't entirely sure where I was. The forest seemed endless, and the deeper I went, the more disconnected I felt from the world I had left behind. By the time I realized how far I had strayed, it was too late. The daylight was starting to fade, and the dense canopy above blocked much of the sunlight, casting everything in a dusky glow. I wasn't scared, not yet, but I knew I needed to turn back soon if I didn't want to end up hiking in the dark. That's when I heard it, a crack, a branch breaking in the distance, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. They were heavy, purposeful, moving slowly, deliberately. I froze. It wasn't an animal. It was too loud, too rhythmic, like someone walking with intent. My heart pounded in my chest as I glanced around, trying to spot the source of the sound. But I saw nothing. No movement, no figure, just the shifting shadows of the forest. I should have turned around then, but I didn't. Maybe I was curious, or maybe I was trying to convince myself I was overreacting. Either way, I pressed forward, my breath shallow, my every sense heightened. The footsteps continued, always just out of view, but I could hear them clearly. They were getting closer. Quickened my pace, but the sounds followed. Closer and closer. Panic began to rise in my chest, and the realization hit me. I wasn't alone out here. I couldn't explain why or how, but there was someone else in the woods with me. I had no choice now but to move faster. The path ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, twisting and turning, with no end in sight. My legs were starting to ache, and I was beginning to feel the weight of the backpack pulling me down. The sound of footsteps was right behind me now, each step heavy and deliberate. In a desperate move, I veered off the trail, cutting through thick underbrush. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away. My breath was coming in short gasps, and I stumbled over rocks and roots, barely managing to keep my footing. The sounds of pursuit stopped for a moment, but I didn't dare slow down. Then, just as quickly as they had stopped, the footsteps started again. Closer this time, almost as if the person, or whatever it was right behind me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I could feel the presence, the weight of it pressing down on me. I had to get out of here. I pushed forward, my body burning with exhaustion. That's when I saw it, a clearing ahead. It was small, but it offered a glimmer of hope. I sprinted toward it, my legs screaming in protest, and broke into the open space, finally feeling the fresh air on my face. I didn't stop, though. I ran, not looking back, not even daring to glance over my shoulder. The clearing led me to a small, babbling creek. I didn't hesitate. I followed the water, hoping it would lead me to safety. The sound of rushing water drowned out everything else, and for the first time in hours, I felt a slight sense of relief. I slowed my pace, my mind still racing, and took a moment to catch my breath. The footsteps had stopped. I was alone, at least I thought I was. As the last of the sunlight dipped below the horizon, I finally found the main trail again. It was a small relief, but I didn't feel safe. The air felt thick, and the sense of being followed had not entirely gone. But at least the trail was familiar and the markers were there, clear and steady. I continued down the path, moving cautiously now, constantly glancing over my shoulder. The sounds of the forest, once so comforting, felt oppressive now. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting in the dark, something that had been watching me for much longer than I'd realized. It wasn't until I reached the trailhead, where my car was parked, that I allowed myself to breathe again. I looked around one last time, but everything was quiet. The forest, once so inviting, now seemed hostile, as if it had swallowed me whole and only let me go once I had learned its dark secret. I got into my car and started the engine, not looking back. Couldn't. Something told me that if I did, I would never leave the woods. The hike was over, but the feeling of being followed never truly left. Even now, as I write this, I'm still not sure if I was being followed, or if it was all in my mind. But I know one thing for sure: I won't be going back out there again. I decided to go hiking on a trail I hadn't tried before. It was one of those that wasn't too popular, mostly known by locals and a few experienced hikers. People always said it was peaceful, calm, and quiet, which sounded perfect to me. I'd been feeling overwhelmed with everything: work, life, just the usual noise, and a solo hike seemed like the perfect way to clear my mind. I packed light, just a small backpack with water, a sandwich, a first aid kit, and a flashlight. I didn't need anything else. The day was bright, sunny, and there was a slight breeze. Felt like the perfect day for a hike. The trailhead was small, just an old signpost with the name of the trail painted on it. No fancy markings, no welcoming words, just an arrow pointing into the woods. I could see where the trail began, a thin path that cut into the thick trees. It was a well-worn path, so it didn't look like it would be too difficult to follow. I adjusted my backpack and started walking. First, the trail was easy. The ground was packed dirt, the trees high above, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. Birds chirped in the distance, and the soft crunch of leaves under my boots was the only sound. I kept my eyes on the trail, my pace steady, my thoughts drifting. The path twisted and turned, and soon the trees closed in around me, blocking out the sunlight. The air grew cooler, and the sounds of the outside world started to fade away. I was deep in the woods now, the trail winding through thick foliage. Felt like I was in a different world. The peacefulness was almost unsettling. No other hikers, no animals, just me and the path ahead. The silence felt too thick, like it was pressing in on me from all sides. The deeper I went, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Not in a supernatural way, just in a way that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. After about an hour of walking, I reached a small clearing. It wasn't much, just a patch of grass surrounded by tall trees. But as I stepped into the clearing, something caught my attention. There was a strange mark on one of the trees, a series of cuts, almost like a symbol. It wasn't deep, just shallow scratches, but they looked deliberate. I frowned and took a step closer, wondering if it was from another hiker or maybe some sort of animal. But the pattern didn't look natural. It looked intentional, like someone had made it. I quickly snapped a photo with my phone, just to remember it, then turned away. The air felt heavy here, and I felt a sudden urge to move on. I checked the time on my phone. It was just past noon, and I still had a few hours before I needed to head back. I wanted to make the most of it, so I took a deep breath and kept walking. The trail became more rugged after the clearing. The dirt path was uneven, with rocks and roots sticking up from the ground. The trees became denser, and I had to duck under branches that reached out like fingers. I was still alone, and the thought crossed my mind again. Why hadn't I passed anyone yet? Even if the trail wasn't well known, it was still a public hike. It didn't make sense that I hadn't seen a single soul. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I pulled it out to check. It was a text from a friend asking how the hike was going. I quickly typed back that everything was fine, then checked the time. It was nearly 2 p.m., but I didn't feel like it had been that long since I started. The woods seemed to distort time in some strange way. I stuffed my phone back into my pocket and continued walking, now acutely aware of the silence. There were no birds chirping, no rustling in the underbrush, nothing. Just the sound of my boots on the trail and the occasional creak of tree branches above. It was like the forest had become a living, breathing thing, and it was holding its breath, waiting for something. I came across another oddity about 20 minutes later. There was a small creek crossing the trail, the water clear and fast-moving. But there, on the edge of the water, was another symbol carved into a stone. It looked similar to the one on the tree, but this one was on a flat rock, the edges jagged and rough. I crouched down, studying it. There was no way this was natural. It was too deliberate, too precise. It almost looked like some kind of warning. But for what? I stood up quickly, my unease growing. It was probably nothing, I told myself. Maybe some kids had been out here messing around. But why would they go so far out on a quiet trail like this? My mind wandered, thinking about all the stories I'd heard growing up, about strange things happening in the woods, about people getting lost, about hikers who just disappeared. I shook my head, dismissing the thoughts. There was no reason to panic. This was just a hike, and I was just overthinking things. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, and the air was growing cooler. I glanced up ahead. The trail curved around a bend, and I could see the darkening forest stretching out before me. My instincts told me it was time to turn back, but there was something about the way the trail looked ahead that drew me in. I wanted to see where it went, so I pushed on, though my pace quickened, as if I was trying to outrun the growing discomfort gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. The trail seemed to narrow as I walked, the trees pressing closer together. The further I went, the more the atmosphere changed. It wasn't just the silence anymore. It was the feeling that something was there, watching. I wasn't sure how to explain it, but it felt like the woods were alive, like the trees and the rocks and the earth itself were all aware of my presence. Then suddenly the trail came to an abrupt stop. There was no warning, no sign of where the path had gone. Just thick brush, tangled vines, and a steep drop-off to one side. I frowned, confused. I couldn't have walked this far and just hit a dead end. I turned around, scanning the area for another path, but the way back looked just as confusing as the way forward. The trail had disappeared. I took a deep breath and tried to calm myself. There had to be a way out of this. I pulled out my phone to check the map, but the screen was black. I pressed the power button, trying to get it to turn on, but it didn't respond. My stomach dropped. I was completely out of signal. I shoved the phone back into my pocket and started walking along the edge of the brush, hoping to find some sign of where the trail continued. The more I walked, the more I realized how quiet it was. It was like the world had gone still. Not even the wind was moving. I could feel my heart pounding, my breath shallow, but I kept going, hoping I'd find a way out. Then, I noticed something, a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. It was quick, too quick to be sure, but I swore I saw something dark just beyond the trees. My first instinct was to ignore it, but curiosity got the better of me. I took a few cautious steps toward where I had seen the movement. That's when I heard it, a soft rustling sound, like footsteps, moving through the underbrush. My blood ran cold. There was no one else out here, not until now. I stood frozen, my body tense, trying to figure out what was happening. The rustling stopped, and then silence again. The air felt heavier, thicker, as if I was being suffocated by the very woods themselves. I needed to get out. Panic surged through me. I started running, pushing through the underbrush, stumbling over rocks, not caring about anything except getting away from whatever was out there. I didn't look back, couldn't. The rustling followed me, growing closer, but I didn't dare stop. My legs burned. My lungs screamed for air, but I kept pushing forward. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the rustling stopped. I slowed down, my breath ragged, my eyes darting around, but there was nothing, no sound, no movement, just the stillness of the woods. I didn't wait to analyze it. I turned and ran back, retracing my steps until I finally found the trail again. I didn't stop running until I reached the trailhead, where the sunlight filtered through the trees and the world felt normal again. My heart was still pounding in my chest, but the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, was gone. I made it back to my car and sat there for a long time, just staring at the trees, trying to make sense of everything. But no matter how hard I thought about it, I couldn't explain what had happened. I was just thankful to be out of the woods, safe. It was the last time I ever went hiking alone. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend getaway, the kind of hike that clears your head after a stressful work week. I had mapped out the trail, packed my bag, and even double-checked the weather forecast. There were no warnings, no storm clouds in sight, just a perfect Saturday morning to take a walk through the woods. The trail I chose was out in the middle of nowhere, quiet, isolated, with no distractions. There was a peacefulness to it that seemed like a dream. The air was crisp, cool but not too cold, with just the right amount of sunlight filtering through the trees. The path twisted through dense forest, and the scent of damp earth and pine needles filled the air. Every now and then, I'd hear the rustle of leaves or the chirp of a bird, sounds that made me feel like I was the only person in the world, in the best way possible. As I started walking, I took in the surroundings. Tall, ancient trees towering over me, their leaves slowly turning with the changing seasons. The forest floor was a blanket of fallen leaves, and my boots crunched with each step. I could feel the serenity of the place, as though it was untouched by time. I felt good about my decision to leave behind the noise of the city and step into this secluded piece of nature. But it didn't stay peaceful for long. About an hour into the hike, I noticed something odd. There were signs, small ones at first, that something wasn't quite right. I wasn't sure how to explain it, but the forest didn't feel welcoming anymore. The trees seemed to be closing in a little tighter, the shadows longer, and the air a little thicker. At first, I brushed it off as just my mind playing tricks. After all, it was a quiet, dense forest, and sometimes nature can be unsettling if you're alone for long enough. But then I noticed something more troubling. The path, which had been wide and clear, started narrowing. The trees seemed to get thicker, and the ground became uneven, with rocks jutting out at odd angles. It wasn't unmanageable, but it was harder to navigate. The further I went, the more the trail seemed to disappear altogether. At one point, I had to step over a small fallen tree, and after that, I couldn't quite figure out where the trail had gone. I looked around, hoping to spot a marker or something that would tell me I was still on the right path, but there was nothing, just trees. Dense, overwhelming trees. I thought about turning back, but then I saw something, a flicker of movement in the distance. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or some other small creature, but the shape was off, too large and too still. I stopped, squinting my eyes, trying to make sense of it. It was just out of reach of the sunlight, hidden in the shadows. For a moment, I wondered if I was imagining it. The longer I looked, though, the more I felt that unsettling sensation creeping up my spine, that something was out of place. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but then it moved, slowly. A dark figure, almost blending into the shadows, shifted just enough to confirm that it was real. My heart skipped a beat. I was alone, miles away from anyone, and there was no one around for miles. I forced myself to turn away, shaking my head to clear it. It wasn't anything. I was just getting paranoid. But still, I kept glancing back over my shoulder as I continued along the increasingly confusing trail. Soon, I was walking faster, more focused on finding the path than anything else. The weird sensation in my gut kept growing, though. The feeling that I was being watched followed. It wasn't just in my head, either. The more I walked, the more I noticed the strange silence. There were no birds singing anymore, no wind blowing through the leaves, just stillness, and I realized how quiet it had gotten. Too quiet. That's when I heard it, the sound of footsteps behind me. It was subtle at first, a slight crunch of leaves, then a stick snapping. I stopped, my pulse racing, and listened. My mind scrambled for an explanation. An animal? Another hiker? But I couldn't hear anything else. It was the kind of sound that didn't belong in the natural stillness around me. I started walking faster, hoping to get to the clearing I knew had to be close. I could feel my breath quickening, the back of my neck prickling with every step. I knew I should have turned around earlier, but now I was too deep into the woods, and the path was growing even more treacherous. Suddenly, I felt it, something cold and wet brushing against my leg. A branch? No, it was too soft, too deliberate. I jumped back, heart hammering, and turned to find nothing. The trail was empty, just trees and underbrush, but my breath came in shallow gasps. and I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was just out of sight. I didn't want to panic, but the thought crept in that I might not make it out of here. The feeling of being followed didn't go away. It only intensified as I kept walking, my pace faster now, a sense of urgency taking over. The path kept winding, and the trees seemed to close in even more. The daylight was starting to fade, the shadows of the trees stretching long, and I realized I had lost track of time. I stopped at a fork in the trail, unsure of which direction to take. One path led further into the woods, darker and less defined, while the other wound up a small hill. I hesitated. My instincts told me to go up the hill to get some height, some clarity. But when I looked up at the hill, something made my blood run cold. At the top of the hill, barely visible against the gray sky, there was a figure standing still, watching me. Person. A tall figure. I couldn't make out details, but I could see enough to know that it wasn't just my mind playing tricks. It was real. I don't know what made me do it, but I turned and ran. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I pushed myself harder than I thought possible. I didn't look back, just kept running through the underbrush, tripping over roots and rocks. I knew the path had to be close. There had to be a way out. I had to find it. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, I burst out into an open area. The trees opened up to a meadow, and I could see the trail again. Clear, distinct, and welcoming. I slowed down, catching my breath, looking around. The air felt different here, brighter, but I didn't feel safe yet. I kept walking, but every part of me was on high alert. I wasn't sure if I had truly lost whatever was following me, or if it was just waiting for me to make a mistake. When I finally made it back to the parking area, the sun was setting, and the sky was painted in hues of orange and pink. I sat in my car, locking the doors, breathing deeply. I didn't know what had happened, what I had seen, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going back to that trail. The hike was supposed to be peaceful, a way to escape the grind of everyday life. Instead, it left me with more questions than answers. What had I really seen? What had been following me? And why did I feel like I had barely escaped something far worse than I could understand? I looked out at the forest one last time before driving away, the trees now dark shadows in the distance, as if they were hiding something from me. I wasn't sure if I'd ever understand what happened out there, but I knew this for certain. Next time, I'd stick to more populated trails. Some places, it seemed, were best left unexplored. I set off on the hike alone. It wasn't that I wanted to, but I didn't have a choice. Everyone else had plans. Some had work, some had commitments, and some were just not interested in hiking. I thought I'd enjoy the solitude, though. The mountains were supposed to be quiet this time of year, the sort of place where you could lose yourself in the sound of your own thoughts, far from the noise of daily life. The trailhead wasn't far from my house, just a 30-minute drive through winding roads and up a small mountain. The sun was still low when I reached the base, just rising enough to cast a golden glow over the treetops. It was a beautiful morning, crisp but not too cold, perfect for a long hike. I locked my car and swung my backpack over my shoulders. The map in my pocket told me I was heading for a well-traveled route, a path that looped around the ridge and offered incredible views. But even though it was a popular trail, something about it felt different. Maybe it was the way the trees pressed in so close, or how the trail seemed to narrow in certain spots. Or maybe it was just the stillness in the air, like the world was holding its breath. I shrugged it off. I was used to nature being a little offbeat sometimes. The path wasn't hard to follow at first. The ground was dirt, soft beneath my boots, and the trees were thick with pine needles and moss. It wasn't long before the chatter of the world around me faded. The only sounds were my footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. At the start of the trail, there were markers every so often, wooden signs with arrows pointing me in the right direction. I passed one that indicated I was going in the right direction and headed deeper into the woods. As I climbed higher, the trail grew steeper. The ground was more uneven here, with loose rocks that threatened to trip me. But I kept going. There was something oddly comforting about the silence, the lack of distractions. By the time I reached a small clearing, the sun was high enough in the sky that the shadows were growing shorter. I stopped to take a drink from my water bottle, resting on a rock. The view was breathtaking. To the east, the valley stretched for miles, a patchwork of green fields and winding rivers. The mountains beyond were still partially covered in mist, their tops peeking out like jagged teeth. It was beautiful, almost surreal, like a painting come to life. I spent a moment just breathing it in, taking it all in. I don't know what happened next, but suddenly, the air around me felt different. Not colder, but heavier, as if the trees themselves were watching me. I glanced around, but nothing seemed unusual. I shook off the feeling. It was probably nothing. Maybe just the quiet or the solitude playing tricks on my mind. I finished my water and pushed on. The trail became more challenging. The upward incline steepened, and the trees thinned out, giving way to more rocky terrain. I had to use my hands to climb over some of the larger boulders. It felt good to push myself, the kind of effort that made you feel alive. After what felt like hours, I reached a ridge that offered a breathtaking view of the valley below. I took a seat on a large rock, pulling out a granola bar. The wind was picking up, swirling around me, and I wrapped my jacket tighter around myself. The sun was starting to dip lower now, and I knew I needed to keep moving if I wanted to make it back before dark. But as I stood up, I noticed something odd. The trail, which had been fairly straightforward up until now, seemed to split into two paths. One path was well-worn, clearly used, but the other was barely visible, overgrown with weeds and underbrush. The map I had didn't show a split here. I should have been headed to the right, but the left path, though unmarked, seemed interesting. Maybe it would lead to a more remote part of the ridge. I hesitated. The sensible thing would have been to stick to the main trail, but something about the overgrown path called to me. I shrugged, telling myself I had plenty of time. Besides, what's the worst that could happen? I took the left path. The further I went, the more I realized this path was less traveled. The underbrush was thick, and the ground was uneven, making it harder to walk. But there was something about the solitude that felt calming, like I was leaving behind the world of people and entering some untouched part of nature. Eventually, the trees grew thicker again, and the sun started to dip lower, casting long shadows over the forest floor. The air grew colder, the scent of pine sharper, but there was still a sense of quiet, a deep, unnerving silence that settled in my bones. That's when I heard it, a snap. It was faint, barely noticeable, but I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The noise had come from somewhere ahead of me, from deeper in the woods. I took a cautious step forward, then another, but I didn't hear anything more. I told myself it was probably just an animal, maybe a deer or a squirrel. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I shook my head and tried to brush off the unease. It was just my imagination, I told myself. But as I kept walking, the sense of unease only grew. The path seemed to wind in on itself, and the trees around me grew thicker, blocking out what little light was left. The air felt colder now, and I couldn't hear the usual sounds of wildlife. No birds, no rustling of leaves, just silence. Then I saw it. At first, it looked like a shadow, a dark shape moving between the trees. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart racing. I tried to focus, my eyes straining in the dim light. It was moving, but too quickly for me to make out what it was. My mind screamed that it wasn't an animal. Animals don't move like that. I should have turned back right then, but something kept me rooted to the spot. I wanted to see what it was. My curiosity outweighed my fear. The shadow moved again, and this time I saw it more clearly. It was tall, human-like, but its movements were jerky, unnatural. My stomach twisted in a knot. This wasn't right. It wasn't normal. I turned to leave. The hike was supposed to be peaceful, but this was something else. I needed to get back to the main trail, back to where things made sense. But the path was gone. I spun around in confusion. The trees, once spaced out, were now so close together that the path I had been following had disappeared. I was surrounded, trapped in the thick, silent woods. The panic hit me in waves, but I forced myself to breathe, telling myself that I was overreacting. My map was still in my pocket. I find my way back. I reached for the map, but it was gone. My heart skipped a beat. I patted my pockets frantically. The map had vanished. My water bottle was gone too. I checked everything. My phone. Nothing. I had nothing. A low hum filled the air, almost imperceptible at first, but growing louder. Sounded like wind, but it didn't feel like wind. Felt wrong. The air seemed to thicken, suffocating. Couldn't breathe. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by another snap. Closer this time. Too close. I turned, but there was nothing. The trees were empty, but that noise, the noise that was so unmistakably real, it couldn't be imagined. Something was out there. I tried to move, tried to find a way back to the main trail, but the forest seemed to shift around me, leading me deeper, further away from safety. I couldn't remember which way I'd come from. The trees, the shadows, they all blurred together. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the pressure lifted. The hum faded, the air lightened, and I could breathe again. I didn't question it. I turned and ran. The woods seemed endless, the path never ending, but I didn't stop until I stumbled back to the main trail. My heart was pounding in my chest, my breath ragged as I collapsed onto the dirt path. The sunlight had returned, almost as if nothing had happened. The birds were singing again, the wind rustling the leaves. The world was calm, peaceful even, but I knew something had changed. I crossed into something I couldn't explain. It was something that was still with me, hidden in the quiet spaces of the forest, waiting. I walked down the trail, my legs shaky but relieved to be back on familiar ground. When I reached the car, I didn't hesitate. I didn't even look back. It was a peaceful evening. The sky was clear, and the sun was setting in a spectacular orange and pink hue. But I knew one thing for sure. I wouldn't be hiking alone again anytime soon. As I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't the only one who had come back from that hike. I felt it, a weight, invisible but heavy, like the woods had left something behind with me. And maybe, just maybe, I wasn't the one who had been lost after all. It was just supposed to be a quiet hike, something simple, a few hours in the woods, a chance to clear my mind and stretch my legs. I've done it 100 times before. Picked a trail, grabbed my gear, and walked into the trees, just me and the world. No company needed, no distractions. I love the outdoors, the peace it gives me. But this time, things didn't go as planned. This time, I didn't come back the same. It was late September when I decided to take the trail that day. I remember because of the chill in the air, the kind of crispness that only comes with autumn creeping in. The leaves were changing, patches of orange, yellow, and red scattered across the trees. I thought it'd be the perfect time for a quiet walk, so I grabbed my pack and set off early. The trail I picked was one I'd done before, a route that wound through the woods, following the edge of a creek before slowly ascending up a hillside. Nothing too difficult, nothing too far. Just a nice, peaceful walk, or so I thought. The trailhead was just off a small country road, and I pulled my car into the lot, locking it behind me. I was alone, but that didn't bother me. I preferred it that way. At first, everything was fine. The crunch of leaves beneath my boots, the smell of wet earth in the air, the soft babble of the creek as I crossed it. It all felt normal, comfortable, the kind of peaceful solitude I'd been craving. I'd been walking for about an hour when I noticed something off. It wasn't much, just a slight feeling that I wasn't alone. I shook it off, thinking it was just my mind playing tricks on me. It happens sometimes when you're alone in the woods. The wind had picked up, rustling the branches above me, and the sound of birds chirping had quieted down. I noticed that the trail had started to get steeper, but I wasn't worried. It wasn't a difficult climb, just a steady incline. But the farther I went, the more I felt it, like someone was watching me. At first, it was easy to dismiss. The sound of sticks snapping in the distance, the rustling of leaves. But after a while, it became hard to ignore. I began to speed up, hoping that the feeling would pass. But the feeling didn't go away. It stayed, hanging in the air, weighing on me like a heavy cloud. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. I was just being paranoid. There's no one out here, I thought. The trail was remote after all. People didn't come out here often. I was too far into the woods for anyone else to be around. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Then, about 2 hours into the hike, I noticed something strange. I had crossed a small bridge over a stream, and as I looked around, I saw what I thought was a figure moving through the trees. It was quick, too quick for me to make out details, but I definitely saw it. It wasn't an animal. It was human-shaped. I froze, heart pounding. I waited for a few seconds, listening for any sound, any movement. But there was nothing, just the wind in the trees. I stepped forward cautiously, trying to stay quiet, but the noise of my boots on the rocks and dirt made me feel like I was walking on glass. After what felt like forever, I decided it was nothing. My mind was just playing tricks on me, probably an animal or a shadow from the trees. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself down, and continued up the trail. The trees began to thin out, and I found myself standing on the edge of a small clearing. The sun was dipping lower, casting long shadows across the ground. It was getting late, but I wasn't worried. The trail looped back toward the car from here. I just had to keep going for a little while longer. But then I heard something. It was soft, distant at first. A voice, barely audible, but definitely a voice. I stopped in my tracks, straining to hear. It sounded like a man, calling out, just one word over and over. "Hey!" I spun around, heart racing, but there was no one. The clearing was empty, just the trees and the sound of wind. I didn't see anyone, but that voice, it wasn't my imagination. I was sure of it. I stood there for a few moments trying to calm my breathing. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe I'd been out here too long. But no, this felt different. It was too real to ignore. I didn't know what to do. Should I go toward the voice? Should I keep moving on the trail? My instincts told me to turn back, to leave this area and not look back. But I couldn't shake the thought. What if someone was out there, hurt, needing help? After a moment's hesitation, I chose to move forward. I had to know. I couldn't just ignore it. I walked toward the source of the voice, my footsteps slow and deliberate. The clearing was narrow, only about 20 yards wide. The voice was getting louder, more insistent now, calling, "Hey!" over and over. But still, I couldn't see anyone. Then, I reached the other side of the clearing, and my foot caught on something, a root or maybe a rock. I stumbled, but caught myself, and that's when I saw it. At the edge of the clearing, just behind a large rock, I noticed a shape, something dark, something out of place. I didn't move for a moment, just stared at it. The voice stopped. No more "hey," no sound at all. My heart thudded in my chest as I took a step closer. And then I saw what it was. It was a backpack, a hiking backpack, dark green, lying on the ground near a small cluster of trees. There was no one around, but the pack was definitely there, untouched. A rush of unease filled me. Why was it here, alone? It didn't make sense. I looked around, but there were no other signs of a person. No trail of footsteps, no broken branches. It was as if whoever owned the pack had just vanished. I stepped closer, but before I could reach it, I froze. There was something else. Something in the trees, just beyond the clearing. A flash of movement. Someone or something was watching me. I felt my stomach drop. I wasn't alone. I had to leave. I had to get out of there. I turned on my heel and started walking fast, then running. The trail was further ahead, and the thought of getting back to the safety of the marked path was the only thing on my mind. But as I ran, I heard something behind me. Footsteps. Not my own, but someone else's. I didn't dare look back. I just kept running, my breath coming in short, desperate gasps. The path was getting steeper now, the trail more difficult to follow. The light was fading, and I could barely see. But I didn't care. I pushed myself harder, my legs burning with the effort. When I reached the point where the trail looped back toward the parking lot, I stopped. I dared to glance behind me, half expecting to see someone or something coming after me, but there was nothing. The woods were silent, empty. I felt a rush of relief. It was over. I wasn't being followed, but that didn't mean I was safe. I hiked the last stretch of the trail as quickly as I could, my heart still pounding. The trees around me began to thin, and soon, I saw the parking lot up ahead. I burst out of the woods, breathless, and didn't stop until I reached my car. I locked the door behind me and sat there, my hands gripping the steering wheel. What had just happened? Who left the pack behind? Was someone else out there, lost? Or was it something else entirely? I don't know. But one thing was clear. I wasn't going back on that trail again. I started the engine and drove home, the silence in the car almost as unnerving as the woods had been. But I didn't care. I was safe now. I was never really the outdoorsy type, but I thought a solo hike might be just what I needed. I had been feeling a little disconnected from everything lately. Work, friends, and even my own thoughts. A weekend away from all the noise seemed like the perfect solution. So I packed a backpack with the essentials: water, snacks, a first aid kit, and a map. I wasn't aiming for anything too crazy, just a few hours on a well-marked trail in the nearby forest. The air was cool, the sun was out, and the idea of being alone in nature sounded peaceful. The trail started off easy, just a narrow path winding through the trees. The crunch of the dirt and leaves under my boots was soothing, and the quiet around me felt different from the usual noise of the city. There was something special about being surrounded by nothing but trees, sky, and the occasional bird call. I was only a couple of miles in when I realized how isolated I was. The sounds of civilization seemed to fade away, replaced by the occasional rustle of animals in the underbrush or the wind moving through the leaves. After a while, the trail became less clear. At first, I chalked it up to the fact that it was a less traveled route, but soon the path was barely visible. It was strange because I had checked the map earlier, and this part was supposed to be easy to follow. I hesitated for a moment. There were no other hikers around, no one to ask for directions. But the thought of turning back felt like giving up, and I wasn't ready to do that. I pushed forward, hoping I'd find a way back to the main trail soon enough. The trees began to close in around me. The sky above, once bright and clear, was now mostly blocked by the dense canopy. The temperature started to drop, and I regretted not bringing an extra layer. My breath came out in little clouds as I moved deeper into the woods. It was strange. Everything felt different now. The forest had gone quiet, almost too quiet. No more bird songs, no more rustling, just silence. I pulled out my map again, trying to reassure myself that I was still on the right track. The little squiggly lines marking the trails were hard to make out in the dim light, and I found myself squinting. I had always trusted my sense of direction, but now that I was out here, I started to feel unsure. My heart rate picked up, and I found myself glancing around nervously. My instincts, which had always served me well in the city, were suddenly on high alert. The path grew more uneven, with roots and rocks sticking up from the ground. It made walking more difficult, and I had to slow down. There was something about the way the forest seemed to close in on me that was starting to get under my skin. The trees weren't just trees anymore. They felt like they were watching, looming, almost like they were crowding in from every side. As I pushed forward, I thought I heard something in the distance. It was faint at first, just a soft shuffling sound, like someone or something was moving through the brush. My mind immediately went to worst-case scenarios, as it often did. Was it another hiker? An animal? My eyes darted in every direction, but the trees were thick, and I couldn't see anything beyond a few feet in front of me. The sound stopped. I stood still for a moment, listening carefully. My breath was shallow, my heart pounding in my chest. I told myself it was nothing, just the wind or an animal moving around. But the longer I stood there, the more the silence around me seemed oppressive, heavy. I decided to move on, faster this time. My footfalls were louder, more hurried than before. The path twisted and turned, and I found myself climbing slightly, the ground becoming more uneven. The temperature continued to drop, and the air started to feel thick, like it was harder to breathe. I had no idea how far I had walked at this point. The light was fading too, and I realized that I had been so focused on the trail that I hadn't even noticed how quickly the day was slipping away. The panic started to set in. I had no signal on my phone, no way to call for help. The trees were dense, and I could barely see anything beyond a few feet in front of me. I reached for my water bottle, but I was down to just a few sips left. My stomach growled, reminding me that I hadn't eaten much since breakfast. I was getting tired, frustrated, and a little scared, and then I heard it again. The sound. This time it was closer, much closer. I froze, holding my breath. It was a distinct sound now, a rustling in the brush, followed by the sound of something heavy moving through the undergrowth. My pulse quickened. I was no longer alone. I told myself it was just an animal, but my gut was telling me something different. I slowly looked around, trying to stay calm. The trees all looked the same, tall, dark, and unmoving. I had no idea where the sound was coming from, and it was driving me crazy. I started walking again, faster this time. I didn't know what I was running from, but something told me I needed to get back to the main trail and fast. The path opened up into a small clearing, and I stopped, breathless. The light was now almost completely gone, the shadows stretching long and dark across the ground. I stood there for a moment, my mind racing. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, a primal sense of danger flooding over me. Something wasn't right. The air felt thick, like it was pressing in from all sides. And then, just as I was about to turn back, I saw something, a figure, standing on the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of the fading light. Person, or what I thought was a person. I couldn't see their face, but the shape was too still, too quiet. My heart thudded in my chest as I stared at it. They didn't move, didn't make a sound. It was as if they were waiting for me to make the next move. I turned, desperate now, my feet slipping on the uneven ground as I stumbled away. I didn't look back. I knew I had to get out of there. The panic was overwhelming now, my breath shallow and rapid, my head spinning. I had no idea where I was going, but I couldn't stop. My foot caught on a root and I went down hard, the impact jarring my whole body. Pain shot through my knee, and for a moment, I couldn't move. I just lay there, gasping for air, listening for the sound of footsteps, the rustle of leaves, anything that might indicate someone or something was coming closer. I pushed myself up, ignoring the pain in my leg, and stumbled forward, my senses on high alert. Every noise seemed amplified now. The wind in the trees, my own footsteps, the beating of my heart. Finally, after what felt like hours, I broke through the trees and found the main trail. I didn't stop to catch my breath. I didn't even look back. I just ran, as fast as I could, until I reached the parking lot. It wasn't until I was safely in my car, the engine running, that I allowed myself to calm down. The terror that had gripped me slowly began to fade, replaced by a strange sense of relief. But even as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been following me, waiting for me to let my guard down. Took me a while to process everything. Was it just my imagination? Was it exhaustion? Or had I actually encountered something out there? Something that wasn't right? I'll never know for sure. But one thing's for certain, I won't be going back out there alone anytime soon. The sun was beginning to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the forest. It wasn't too late in the day, but I could already feel the shift in the air, the way the temperature dropped as night crept in. I had been hiking for hours alone. The path had started as a well-worn trail, but now it was barely a line through the dense woods, with overgrown branches brushing against my legs and rocks hidden beneath layers of fallen leaves. The farther I went, the quieter everything became. I had expected the forest to be full of life, birds, squirrels, maybe even deer, but it was silent. The only sounds were my footsteps crunching the leaves and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. I wasn't new to hiking, but something about this trail felt different. Felt off. I stopped for a moment to check my map. I had planned on taking the trail up to the ridge, but now it seemed like I had gone off track. The map showed the path should have been wider here, more distinct. I frowned, trying to make sense of the faded lines and markings. The trail I had been following looked nothing like what was on the map. I took a deep breath and decided to press on. I had been hiking for hours, and turning back now seemed pointless. The trees grew thicker, their trunks massive and twisted, reaching high into the sky. The air felt heavier, and I could sense something in the atmosphere, like the weight of the woods was pressing down on me. I adjusted the straps on my backpack and started walking again, a little faster now, hoping to reach the top of the ridge before darkness fully settled in. As I pushed through the brush, something caught my eye, a flicker of movement, just a brief flash, like something had darted between the trees. My heart skipped a beat. I stopped, listening. There was nothing, just the breeze rustling through the leaves. I shook my head, trying to brush it off. It was probably just an animal, a deer or something. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Minutes passed, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It wasn't just the occasional rustle in the undergrowth or the snap of a twig. It was more than that. It was the sensation that something was following me, waiting for me to slip, to make a mistake. I glanced over my shoulder, but there was nothing. Just trees, shadows stretching longer as the sun set. I kept walking, but the silence was oppressive now. I felt like I was no longer in control of my own pace. My legs were heavy, and every step seemed to take more effort than the last. The path was winding more sharply, and I noticed the air was cooler now. I zipped up my jacket and continued, wishing I could shake off the unease that had settled in my stomach. The deeper I went into the forest, the more the landscape started to change. The trees were no longer the tall, sturdy pines I had grown used to on hiking trails. Now they were twisted, their limbs gnarled and reaching like hands, grabbing at the sky or each other. The ground beneath my boots became soft, muddy, like the earth itself was trying to slow me down. My boots sunk into the muck with each step, and the weight of my pack started to feel unbearable. Then I heard it, a noise, a soft crack, like a twig snapping. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Slowly, I turned my head, scanning the trees around me. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, I saw it, a shadow darting behind a cluster of bushes. It was fast, too fast for an animal. I took a step back, my instincts screaming at me to turn around, to leave. But I didn't. Instead, I reached for my phone, hoping for a signal. I knew it was pointless. I had checked before, and there was no service out here, but the reassurance of having it in my hand made me feel a little better. The screen flickered for a moment, then went black. I tried to turn it back on, but nothing. It was dead. I cursed under my breath and shoved it back into my pocket. My mind raced. Should I keep going? Should I turn back? But the thought of heading back down that trail, alone in the dark, was even worse. I had no choice but to move forward. The path grew even more difficult to navigate, the trees closing in on me. Every step felt harder, as if the forest itself was trying to keep me from leaving. My breath came in short gasps, and I started to feel lightheaded. I had to be close to the ridge by now, I thought, just a little farther. But then I stumbled. My foot caught on something, and I went down hard, my knee slamming into a rock. I gritted my teeth, biting back the pain. Blood dripped from the scrape on my leg as I pushed myself up, but the pain was nothing compared to the panic rising in my chest. I had been walking for hours, but now I wasn't sure which direction I was headed. I couldn't tell if I was closer to the ridge or farther from it. The path had vanished, and the forest around me was just a blur of twisted trees and shadows. I had to stop for a moment. I leaned against a tree, breathing heavily. My pulse was racing, my body trembling. Something wasn't right. I could feel it deep in my gut. This wasn't just a simple misstep or an off-trail adventure. This was something more. I didn't know what, but I knew I couldn't stay out here much longer. I closed my eyes, trying to center myself. I needed to think clearly. I had to find a way out of this forest.